Chapter 8 of Tractate Bava Metzia begins discussion on the 4 different types of men who have responsibility for an item, the 4 types of guardians, essentially, the unpaid guardian, the paid guardian, the borrower, and the renter. The first motion now begins. Generally, a borrower is responsible and liable to repay for pretty much any loss or damage to the borrowed object. However, if the owner of the item was working for the borrower at the time the item was damaged, the borrower is not responsible. Specifically, if somebody borrowed a cow and also had the owner of the cow working for him at the same time, and then the cow died, the borrower is exempt. As the verse states, if the owner is with him, he shall not pay. However, if he borrowed the cow and only afterwards hired the owner and then the cow is damaged, he is liable. As the verse says, if the owner is not with him, he shall surely pay. The Gemara explains in the first case, it's possible for the borrower to borrow the cow and hire the owner simultaneously, either if the cow is currently in his courtyard, so he can do both with an oral statement, or it's that he specifically stated that he's only hiring the owner at the moment that he acquires the cow. Additional sources are brought for these points and related rulings that were stated in the previous chapter. There are further sources brought for all the 4 different types of guardians and for the different degrees of responsibility. For instance, the first source for liability by an item being stolen or lost by a borrower are brought, and additionally the source for the exemption if the owner is also employed. In such a case where the owner is employed, it's actually a debate if there is still an exemption of liability if the item got damaged due to the borrower's negligence, which is argued from a few sources. Also, there's an opinion that for there to be an exemption, the owner must be actually working with his actual animal, and that the owner has to be in the borrower's employ when the actual accident occurs, and both of these are disproven. It additionally debates these principles. Some other discussed laws: if somebody borrows an animal specifically in order to sodomize it, is he considered to be a typical borrower as he's benefiting from the animal, or is he like a paid guardian and not liable for an unavoidable accident, as it's not really typical to use it in that manner? Additionally, it's asked, what if somebody borrowed an animal not to use, but just to have around to make himself look wealthy? What's his status of responsibility, as he's not actually using the animal? Another question, what if somebody borrowed an animal to use it for a task worth less than the minimum value of a pruta? Is that considered to be sufficiently legally significant? Additionally, what if somebody borrowed 2 cows to perform 1 task worth of pruta? Is the borrower fully responsible as each individual cow isn't doing a full pruta's worth of a task? A few other questions: if somebody borrowed a cow that was owned by 2 partners and one of the partner owners was hired to also work during this period, is this sufficient to create an exemption for damages as the other worker is in there? Also, if 2 partners borrow a cow and the cow owner was hired by one of the partners, is this sufficient to create an exemption? Thirdly, if somebody borrowed a cow from the property of a woman and then the husband is hired, or if a woman borrowed a cow and the owner was hired by her husband, is this sufficient to create an exemption for damage as discussed? Another question, if somebody tells an agent to be borrowed for me along with my cow to go and work for the borrower, is it sufficient for the agent to go and work in place of the owner to create an exemption? This is all based on a related argument by laws of tithes as to if ownership of produce is considered to be ownership of actual property. Anyways, basically none of these questions are answered here. There are related points along with an additional point. If regarding a woman's personal property, if her husband is considered to be a borrower or a renter, it brings some cases where this creates a relevant distinction. It's also asked, if an animal becomes weakened over the course of its work, is the borrower responsible for this? And it essentially answers no, as even if the animal died during the course of the work, the borrower can say he borrowed it to have it work, not to sit in an enclosure, so he's not responsible. Related to this, it mentions, if a person borrowed a tool from somebody, if it breaks, he should bring witnesses to say that he only used it in a typical working manner and thereby be exempted from any liability. And if there are no witnesses, the borrower must return the pieces of the tool and make up the remainder with payment. Some related points on this principle of exemption: if an animal dies due to a work-related death, somebody borrowed a cat and the mice gathered together and killed the cat, and it was ruled to be a work-related death. In fact, generally, as there's an exemption for liability if the owner of the item is in the borrower's employ prior to the actual borrowing, technically the borrower can just really quickly ask the owner to get him a drink of water before borrowing the item, thereby technically hiring the man, at least legally, and exempting himself from liability with the item. Individuals whose profession puts them in the public employ, such as a school teacher, a butcher, a bloodletter, a town barber, or similar, they're always considered to be in everybody's employ, so if anybody borrows from them, they're considered to be hired, and the borrower is exempt from damages. It debates other particular cases. New Mishnah: if somebody borrows a cow for the first half of a day and rents it for the second half, or borrows a cow for today and rents it for tomorrow, or he borrows 1 cow and rents another identical cow and the cow died, and the owner is claiming that the animal died during the borrowing period, or it's the borrowed cow, and the borrower says he just doesn't know, the borrower is responsible and liable to repay. If the borrower/renter claims that it died as a rental, and the owner says he doesn't know, the borrower/renter is not liable. If the owner said the cow died during the borrowing period, and the borrower says no, it died during the rental period, the borrower needs to take an oath that it occurred as he said, and is then exempt. If the owner and the borrower both say they have no idea when it died, they just divide the contested amount. The Gemara cites opinions which seemingly disagree with the first ruling, and it attempts to disprove them from here. This is discussed further. In the mentioned situation where the owner claims the animal died during the borrowing period and the borrower claimed the animal died during the rental period, the borrower needs to take an oath that it occurred as such. This is as he first needs to swear that the cow died naturally, and then by extension needs to swear that it died as a rental. Additionally, if they both said that they didn't know how it died, they divide the cost, as mentioned, in accordance with the opinion that says entirely doubtful property is just divided without an oath. Now, if somebody borrowed a cow and also hired the owner, as mentioned, exempting himself, and then rented it afterwards, after the owner left, it's a debate if the rental and the borrowing are considered separate, or if the rental is considered to be an extension of the borrowing, thereby retaining his exemption, essentially. It additionally asks about the inverse, what if the man rented it and then borrowed it afterwards? Is this considered to be an extension? And further, what if he borrowed it and then rented it and then re-borrowed it again? What's the law? Does the rental in the middle act as an interposition? And further, what if he rented the cow, borrowed it, and then rented it again? So all of these remain unresolved. New Mishnah, if somebody borrowed a cow and the lender sent it along with his son, or with his slave, or with his agent, or with the son, slave, or agent of the borrower, and the cow died, the borrower is exempt. If, however, the borrower had requested of the owner to send the cow with his son, with his slave, or with his agent, or with your son, slaves, or agent, or the owner volunteered to send any of these individuals and the borrower consented, and then the cow died in transit before the borrower received it, he's liable to repay for the cow. Additionally, if the cow is being returned after use with any of these individuals and it dies in transit, the borrower is still held responsible. The Gemara clarifies it's speaking specifically about a Hebrew slave who isn't fully acquired by his owner, and therefore the borrower is responsible if the animal dies in transit and not the owner of the slave. Some say it could also refer to a Canaanite slave. It's just that it's considered as if the borrower had the man drive it towards him, meaning the borrower is at this point responsible. It debates this latter opinion from a few discussions, so essentially it's been established that a borrower becomes subject to liability when he or his agent takes possession of the borrowed item. Now, if somebody borrows an axe, it said he only acquires it once he uses it to chop wood. This is explained to mean that the owner can no longer renege on his lending agreement at this point. Others still disagree with this principle. It brings related laws on misappropriating temple property. It's also said if a man broke a jug of wine in a market which typically sold for 4 coins, but on market day it sold for 5 coins, before market day they need to return a new jug of wine, and afterwards they need to return the full 5 coins. This only applies if the shopkeeper had no wine to sell. Additionally, the value of the labor and the opening of the wine jug are deducted, as the owner no longer needs to take care of those things. New Mishnah, if somebody exchanges a cow for a donkey with somebody, and then the cow then gives birth, or if somebody sells their Canaanite slave woman who then gives birth and the seller claims she gave birth before the sale and the buyer claims she gave birth after the sale, the value of the calf is divided. If somebody had 2 slaves, say a large one and a small one, or 2 fields, a large one and a small one, and the buyer claims he purchased the larger slave or field, and the seller says he's just not sure which one he sold, the buyer would get the large one. If the seller says he sold the smaller one and the buyer says he's not sure which one he bought, he gets the smaller one. If the seller claims he sold the smaller one and the buyer claims that he bought the larger one, the seller takes an oath that he sold the smaller one, and he then gives that one to the buyer. If they both say they don't know which one was purchased, they divide the disputed value. The Gemara says in the first case, where they're debating when the calf was born, they can't just check where the calf is currently, as it's where the calf is currently in a field belonging to neither of them. This is qualified, and apparently it disputes the opinion which says that if both parties are claiming property that neither possess, it's divided, which apparently would apply if both parties are claiming their side with certainty, although others nevertheless dispute this notion. Now, we said if there was a large and a small slave, and the buyer and seller are both claiming the other one was purchased, the seller needs to take an oath. There are a few issues with this, such as why the borrower isn't the one taking the oath, the fact that taking oaths on slaves isn't really allowed, and others. So it's explained that they're not actually debating over a slave, they're arguing over money to purchase a slave, either a large or a small one, or possibly clothes for a slave, a large one or a small one, etc. It additionally debates between these opinions, along with points as to when such oaths would be permissible. New Mishnah. If somebody sells as olive trees for their wood, and before the buyer cuts them down, the trees then produce olives, if they're so inferior that they produce less than a quarter lug per se'ah, which is a few particular old measurements, the original tree owner can just keep them. If they produce this amount or more, if the buyer claims them as a part of the tree, and the seller tries to claim them as a part of his land, they should just be split. If a river carried off somebody's olive tree and deposited it in somebody else's field, and one claims the olives as a part of his field, and the other claims them as a part of his tree, they should just be split. The Gemara qualifies the circumstances of the first case to be that the seller hadn't specified when he wanted the tree removed, and it's saying that less than a quarter lug per se'ah, people aren't particular about, so the owner can just keep it. More than this, people would care, so it needs to be split as mentioned. Additionally, this quarter lug per se'ah amount is accounted after the cost of harvesting and pressing the olives. Additionally, in the latter case, where a river uproots somebody's tree to somebody else's field, they divide the olives. This is explained to be where the tree is uprooted along with the earth, and only during the first 3 years after it was deposited in the other field, as afterwards he can claim he could have just planted his own tree to benefit his field. Related, if the original owner said he's taking his tree back, he's not permitted to do this, specifically as there's a necessity to plant trees and cultivate within the land of Israel. There are related laws on tithing property. Additionally, it said if somebody broke into somebody else's field and then without permission planted a bunch of trees there, it said if the field isn't ready for trees, they evaluate the cost and he receives a lesser value. If it is ready for trees, they evaluate how much a person would be willing to have somebody plant those trees, and he's then repaid that amount. It brings sources for these principles, which were based on a few particular cases. It brings some additional cases. If somebody rebuilt another man's ruins without consent and then wants to take back his wood and stones, it's a debate if he's allowed to do this. It's ruled he is allowed to take his materials back. But if somebody planted trees and then wanted to take his trees back, specifically within Israel, he's not allowed to do so due to the obligation of cultivating the land of Israel. New Mishnah. If somebody rents his house to another person, he's not allowed to evict him in the winter, which is from the holiday of Sukkot until the holiday of Passover, without notice being given during the summer, which is at least 30 days before the holiday of Sukkot. In large cities, there must always be a 12-month notice before evicting a tenant. Within stores, in small towns, and in large cities, there must be a 12-month eviction notice. Some say with bakers and dye shops, which had much longer credit terms towards customers, as will be mentioned later, they had to be given a 3-year eviction notice. The Gemara says eviction in the winter is prohibited without the notice in the month prior, specifically if the time of rental wasn't specified. Additionally, if even 1 day of the 30 days prior notice before winter extend into the actual winter, the eviction wouldn't be permissible during that winter. The landlord is, however, allowed to increase the rent only if the rental of houses generally became more expensive in the area. If somebody's house collapsed, he's allowed to immediately evict his tenant. Also, if the landlord tries to sell or give the property to a third man, the tenant can prevent this. If the landlord's son just got married and needs a place to stay, he needs to notify his tenant properly before evicting him, and if he doesn't, he can't just evict the tenant. It brings other particular cases. New Mishnah. If somebody's renting a house to a person, the landlord is obligated to provide the tenant with the door, the bolt, and the lock. And also, he needs to construct or repair any necessary living items within the house. If it's something the tenant can make himself, he should. Manure found in the courtyard of a rented house belongs to the owner for use as fertilizer, and the tenants can only keep the oven and stove refuse. The Gemara explains further, a landlord is obligated to build doors, open windows, and strengthen the ceiling or supporting beams, while the tenants need to build ladders, roof railings, plaster the roof, and otherwise. The tenant is responsible to set up the mezuzah. Removing the mezuzah is prohibited unless the tenant was renting from a non-Jewish person. It qualifies which party gets to retain manure or oven refuse based on where it's located. It also qualifies some points on chasing away a mother bird before taking eggs. New Mishnah. If somebody rents a house to somebody for a year and then the year became a leap year, adding a month, the tenant gets the extra month. If the house was rented by the month and it became a leap year, the extra month goes to the landlord. There was a case where somebody rented a bathhouse at 12 gold dinars for a year and 1 gold dinar for a month, and it became a leap year and was ruled to divide the rent for the extra month. The Gemara additionally qualifies these principles as to how they fit with the wording of the Mishnah. If a tenant claims he paid his annual rent on the last day possible, and the landlord denies receiving it, similar to prior cases, the tenant can take an oath that he paid it, and it's sufficient. Also, if a man rents a house for a term of 10 years, and this was written on an undated document, evidently, so the tenant can't just claim ownership of the property after having lived there for a while. If the landlord testifies that the tenant has been there for, say, 5 years, we believe him. It's also said a person can borrow a utensil forever if he asks to use it in its good state, basically so long as it's in good condition. So long as this is done with a full acquisition of the lender committing to do so. And if it breaks, the handle must be returned. It brings some other particular cases. If somebody asks to borrow a hoe to dig this garden, he can only use it to dig that specific garden. If he asks for a hoe to dig a garden, he could dig any garden. There are other broad instances. New Mishnah. If somebody rents a house and it collapses, the landlord must give his tenant a new house. He can't make the new house too large or too small. It also can't now be 2 units, or if it was 2 units, it can't now be 1 unit. There can't be more or less windows unless they both agree to it. The Gemara says this is where the rental wasn't for a particular house, but it was for a house like a particular referenced one, which is why a similar replacement is necessary. This shows that if the stipulated house was on a riverbank, you can't just give him a new riverbank house. It also needs to have all of the same attributes as listed. And that's the end of chapter 8.